Parte 1. The Return. My father disappeared on July 11th, 1986. I was 6 years old. The last thing I remember was him standing in the kitchen, wearing his brown work jacket, pouring milk into a bowl of cereal he didn't eat. He looked tired. Not like exhausted, like drained. The kind of tired you don't bounce back from with a nap or a day off. He smiled at me as he put the milk back in the fridge and said, "I'll be home early." He kissed my mother on the cheek. He never came home. He worked out at Los Alamos National Lab, one of those government facilities that always hovered between public and classified. He was an engineer. That's all I ever knew. He worked long hours, didn't talk about what he did. When Mom asked questions, he'd always say, "Just wires and equations." He left the lab at 4:43 p.m., according to security logs, got into his car, a pale blue Dodge Aries, and drove off the lot. He was never seen again. No trace of the car, no traffic camera footage, though there were only 3 major roads heading into town. No phone calls, no notes, no receipts, nothing, just gone. The official investigation lasted 6 weeks. The unofficial search, my mother's, lasted years. She put up flyers, called his old coworkers, hired a private investigator who disappeared with most of her savings. By 1990, the file was cold. By 1992, she stopped saying his name. By 1998, we stopped talking about him entirely. I grew up, got out of New Mexico, went to college in Oregon, studied anthropology. Which is ironic in retrospect. I was always drawn to missing people, ancient questions, fractured bones, as if solving other puzzles could make up for the one I never got to finish. I didn't visit home much. My mother was brittle by then, angry in that quiet, broken way. She died in 2017. Stroke. Alone. I cleaned out the house in Los Alamos myself. Found his jacket in a sealed box, still faintly smelling like dust and aftershave. I kept it. That was the last I thought of him. Until June 2nd, 2023. The call came from a government number, not local, not listed. A woman introduced herself as Special Agent Palmer with the Department of Homeland Security. "Mr. Rosner," she said, "we need you to come to Albuquerque, immediately." I asked what this was about. Her voice stayed calm, clipped. "We've found your father." My heart stopped. "I think you mean." "No, Mr. Rosner, he's alive." I flew the next morning, didn't sleep, didn't eat. The DHS office was gray and bland, like every other federal building I'd ever seen. Agent Palmer met me in a small conference room with no windows. She was tall, late 40s, suit pressed sharp enough to cut. She didn't sit. "Before we take you to him," she said, "you need to understand something." I nodded. But my stomach was already in my throat. She slid a file across the table. Inside, a photo, color, clean, taken just days ago. It showed a man sitting on a metal bench, hands folded, face turned slightly toward the camera. My father, exactly as I remembered him in 1986. Not older, not different, the same. Not a wrinkle more, not a hair out of place, as if time had simply skipped him. I dropped the photo. "What the hell is this?" She stared at me evenly. "That's what we're trying to find out." They took me to an underground facility just outside Albuquerque, name redacted, signs removed. Inside, everything was clinical. Glass walls, bright lights, not quite hospital, not quite prison. They led me to a viewing room. Behind the glass sat my father. Alive. Same jacket, same posture, same tired eyes. He looked up when I entered. For a long moment, He didn't react. Then his lips moved. One word. Elliot? That's my name. I nodded, tears already spilling. They let me into the room. He stood. We didn't hug. We just stared at each other, like ghosts seeing themselves in mirrors. You look older, he said softly. You look the same. He didn't smile. Where's your mother? I opened my mouth, then closed it. She died, I said. He closed his eyes, nodded once, and sat. The doctor said he'd been found wandering outside a military access road about 90 miles northwest of Los Alamos. No ID, no injuries, disoriented but otherwise healthy. Said his name was Alan Rosner. Said he worked for the lab. Said it was July 11th, 1986. His vitals matched a healthy man in his mid-30s. DNA confirmed his identity. No signs of trauma, no anomalies in blood work, except one. His cells showed almost no aging markers, as if he hadn't aged a day. They ran every test, MRI, PET, EEG. Everything came back normal, except one thing. Every now and then, during sleep, his brain showed bursts of delta activity far beyond normal human range. Deep waves, unmapped, like dreaming in frequencies no one had ever recorded. When asked where he'd been, he just shook his head. I left work, drove south, then I was here. No memories, no gaps filled. Like a door had opened, swallowed him, and spit him out nearly 40 years later. I spent the next 3 days in that facility. We talked, not like father and son, more like two people who had to rebuild language from scratch. I told him about school, Mom, my job, the world. He blinked slowly at most of it, like everything was too much, but he didn't want to say so. But every night, he'd ask the same question. What's the date again? And when I'd tell him, he'd close his eyes and whisper, I shouldn't be here. By the 4th day, I noticed something strange. He didn't sleep, not really. He'd close his eyes, lay still, but the monitors would start pinging after 10 minutes. Heart rate steady, breathing unchanged, but brain activity, wild, spiking like seizures, but smoother, rhythmic, and always when he woke, he'd mutter the same thing. It's still there. I asked him what. He looked at me, eyes wide, almost afraid. The light. Partos. The light. I asked him 3 times what he meant by the light. Each time, his answer changed. The first time he said, it was everywhere. Not bright, but deep, like being underwater in a dream. The second time he said, I think it saw me. The third time, he just looked at the ceiling and whispered, I was inside it. The doctors told me not to push, that his mind might still be adjusting, that temporal displacement, if that's even what it was, could create hallucinations, false memories, trauma responses. But I didn't believe that, because he wasn't just traumatized, he was afraid. They moved him to a lower security medical unit after 7 days, still under observation, but less clinical, more comfortable. I stayed with him most nights. The first night in the new room, he didn't speak for hours, just stared at the corner. Finally, he said, the walls here breathe. I said nothing. He turned to me. They breathe slow, like lungs, like they're asleep. He reached toward the wall and touched it gently, then withdrew his hand. They're listening, he said. The next morning, I found him writing. It was the first time I'd seen him use a pen since his return. He had a pad of lined yellow paper and a government ballpoint. The pages were covered in symbols. Not letters, not math, not even diagrams, just spirals, overlapping, repeating, some small, some covering the whole page. I asked him what they meant. He said, "It's what I remember." Then, "They looked like this when they opened." I asked what opened. He didn't answer. That night, he had a seizure, or what looked like one. He collapsed mid-sentence, eyes wide open, arms rigid, no convulsions, just frozen. The monitor went wild. Brain activity spiked into ranges they hadn't seen before, deeper even than in previous nights. Flatlined, not dead, just blank, for 12 full minutes. The doctors prepared to intubate him. Then suddenly he gasped, sat upright, grabbed my wrist, and said, "It's coming back." The next day, Agent Palmer returned. She'd been absent since the initial interviews. Now she wanted answers. Sat across from him with a folder and a cold look. "We ran your badge credentials through the archive," she said. "Your clearance level was higher than expected." He nodded. "You worked on Project Gossamer?" He looked down. "Tell us what it was." He said nothing. "Mr. Rosner," she said. Sharper now. "We know you weren't just an engineer. We know what Gossamer was about." He raised his eyes. "It was about silence." "What kind of silence?" He smiled. Not warmly. "The kind you can't come back from." After she left, I confronted him. "What was Project Gossamer?" He closed his eyes, sighed. "It was supposed to measure resonance." Resonance? Between fields. Electromagnetic, gravitational, conscious. That last one isn't real. He opened his eyes. "It is when you go far enough." I sat back. "You're telling me you were working on what? Telepathy?" He shook his head. "Communication." "With who?" He looked at me for a long time, then said, "Not who." "What then?" He smiled again, this one full of sadness. "With what listens back." The night after that, he woke me, 3:14 a.m., his voice low, urgent. "It's near." I sat up blinking. "What is?" He pointed to the wall, then the ceiling, then the floor. He whispered, "It's folding." "What's folding?" He didn't answer. The lights flickered. The monitor glitched. For a full 10 seconds, the screen showed all zeros, then snapped back to normal. When the nurse rushed in, he was asleep, or pretending to be. I reviewed the surveillance footage myself. Palmer let me, reluctantly. Between 3:13 and 3:14 a.m., a distortion passed through the video. Not a glitch, not static, more like a wave, a ripple, like heat haze through glass, but inside the room, centered on him. And during those 10 seconds, the timestamp looped twice, from 3:13:58 to 3:13:44 and back, then forward again. 10 seconds repeated, twice, perfectly. I showed the technician. He went pale. "That's not possible," he said. I didn't respond, because deep down, I already knew. The next day, I found him staring at the sky through the window. Clouds drifted by slow and low. He said, "It remembers me." "What does?" "The place." "You mean where you were?" He nodded. "It's awake now, because I left." Then he whispered, "And it's hungry." Parte tres, the hollow window. For the next several days, I kept a notebook, not just for what my father said, but what the room did, because it wasn't just him anymore. Lights flickered at exactly 3:14 a.m. every night. Not before, not after. Every time, the thermostat dropped 3 degrees. One night, the security camera inside his room caught a single frame of something that looked like a person standing beside his bed. but only one frame. Frame before, empty. Frame after, empty. The image was blurred, stretched, no clear features, but the head was tilted, exactly like his. I began asking questions, first to the doctors, then to Agent Palmer. She was more guarded now, tighter, always standing between me and the truth. But one morning, she called me into a back office, closed the door, slid a file across the table. "This never leaves the room," she said. Inside were 6 photographs, black and white, undated. Each one showed a man standing in front of the same blank wall. Different men, different eras. You could tell by the clothes. 1940s, 60s, 70s. One even looked pre-World War I. But they all had the same face. My father's. Exactly the same. Same jawline, same eyes, same tired expression. "I don't understand," I whispered. Palmer sat. "We've seen him before." She laid out a timeline. Patterned incidents, disappearing engineers, scientists, physicists, all tied to restricted locations across the U.S. Oak Ridge, Groom Lake, Hanford, Los Alamos. Men who vanished during active work with electromagnetic or gravitational research. Most never returned. A few did, always disoriented, always ageless. None lived longer than a few months after return. I showed her the symbols my father had been drawing, the spirals, the grids. She flinched, reached into a locked drawer, pulled out a second set of sketches, identical, dated 1953, found in a sealed envelope beneath the floorboards of a house in Nevada. The man who drew them, missing since 1951, returned in 1989, dead within 3 weeks. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by his bed. He looked peaceful, but I knew better. At 3:14 a.m., his eyes opened, not slow, instant. He turned to me. "They're outside." "Who?" He pointed at the window. I stood, pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. Just the courtyard, a few trees, moonlight. Then I saw it. For less than a second, a reflection that wasn't mine, behind me, staring. I spun around. The room was empty. The next morning, he asked to go outside. First time he'd asked for anything. I cleared it with the team. Palmer was hesitant. 10 minutes, she said. No more. We wheeled him into the courtyard. He closed his eyes, tilted his head back into the sunlight. "Smells the same," he said. "What does?" "Time." He opened his eyes again. They didn't build this place for humans. What did they build it for? He smiled, then said, "For what comes through." That evening, he gave me something. A folded piece of notebook paper. "I remembered this," he said. Inside was a drawing of a door, just a rectangle, outlined thick in black. No knob, just a vertical slit of light down the middle. And beneath it, in his handwriting, "You have to stay on the side you belong to." I asked what side that was. He didn't answer, just closed his eyes and whispered, "If they open it again, I won't be the only thing that steps out." Parte 4, the door that waits. A week after our talk in the courtyard, my father stopped speaking altogether. No explanation, no illness. He just went silent. Eyes open, following us around the room, but lips sealed. Not in fear, in refusal. Like he'd decided words were now dangerous. The doctors called it selective mutism due to stress, but I knew better. He wasn't scared. He was protecting something, or someone. Agent Palmer took me aside. "This is escalating," she said. "What is?" She pulled out a photo. Security footage, 3:14 a.m. A frame from inside his room. Same camera as always. But this time, the reflection in the glass door to the courtyard showed a second figure beside his bed. Not him, not me, and not human. Tall, thin, arched shoulders, limbs too long. No face, just light where the head should be. "Have you ever seen this?" she asked. I nodded. "In the mirror." They moved him to a deeper unit. No windows. Lead-lined walls. Soundproofed. Not for him, for whatever might be following him. He didn't resist, just went, blank-eyed, still silent. That night, I was escorted to my hotel under armed guard. Palmer told me they detected anomalies in my own vitals. Elevated brainwave activity between 3:13 and 3:15 a.m. for 5 nights straight. "But I wasn't asleep," I said. "That's what concerns us." She replied, "I dreamed that night. Not like usual. Not even like a nightmare. It felt like memory. I was in a corridor of shifting walls, fluid, pulsing, like they were made of skin and metal and vapor at once. The only light was from a crack in a doorway at the end. Thin, bright, the same image my father had drawn. I walked toward it. The closer I got, the louder the sound became. Not noise, but something like breathing and a low hum and the sound of atoms splitting. Just as I reached the door, it opened from the other side, and something stepped through. I woke up screaming. The next morning, Palmer met me with a suitcase and a warning. "You need to go home." "What are you talking about?" "You've been exposed." "To what?" She paused, then said, "We don't know. That's the point." She pushed the suitcase into my hands. "You were never here. There's no record of you visiting. And if you speak about this to anyone, there are protocols." I laughed. She didn't. But I didn't leave. I waited until the guards rotated. Then I snuck back into the lower level. My father was alone. No cameras. No glass. Just a bed and walls and silence. He looked up when I entered. His eyes widened. He shook his head slowly. "No," he mouthed. I ignored it, sat by his side, held out the sketch he'd given me of the door. "What is it?" He didn't move. Then he whispered, "It's not a door." "Then what is it?" He looked at me. "It's a mirror that only shows what you are when no one else is looking." Behind me, I heard the lights buzz. The room dimmed, and for just a moment, I saw it again, the figure, standing in the reflection of the wall, motionless, watching, its head tilted. Then my father said one last thing before collapsing. "They're done watching." Parte cinco, the fold. He collapsed forward, limp, cold, eyes open but unseeing. Code Blue was called. I was pulled out of the room by 2 guards and shoved into a hallway before I could even touch him again. He didn't die. Not officially. His vitals were inconclusive. No pulse for 11 minutes. No oxygen uptake. No EEG activity. But his skin stayed warm. His pupils still responded to light. And at 3:14 a.m. exactly, he sat back up. No signs of distress. No fatigue, no confusion, just calm. And a single sentence: "The fold has begun." They quarantined him after that. No visitors, no observation, just biometric sensors and a dozen armed personnel outside his door. But I could feel it. Something had changed in me too. The dream came back the next night. The corridor again, the door. But this time, it was already open. Inside, there was a space. Not a room, just space. Limitless, black, yet bright. And hanging in the middle was another version of me, suspended, eyes open, mouth moving, but I couldn't hear the words. I reached for him. He did the same. Our fingers almost touched. Then something pulled me backward with a force so strong, it felt like it ripped a piece of me out of time. I woke up bleeding from the nose and with a bruise across my ribs. No memory of how it happened. The mirror in my hotel room was cracked, split down the center, like a line had been drawn from top to bottom with heat. The word return was written in the condensation on the glass. I packed and went straight back to the facility. Palmer met me at the gate, furious. "You were ordered to leave." "You think this is just about him now?" I snapped. "It's in me too." She didn't respond, just looked away and said, "Then God help us all." We went into the vault together. I don't know why she let me in. Maybe she knew it was too late. My father was seated upright in the center of the room, eyes closed, hands resting on his knees. Around him, patterns, not drawn, not carved, burned into the floor, geometric, recursive, moving even though they were still. I stepped across the threshold, my ears popped, then silence, total. Not just soundless, absent, like noise had been subtracted from reality. I approached him. He opened his eyes, and I wasn't in the room anymore. I was inside the corridor, the real one, not the dream. Except now I knew it wasn't a dream. It had never been. It was memory, stored in me from somewhere else. The walls pulsed like lungs. The light bled from the seams. My father stood at the other end, older now, bearded, worn, but real. He held out his hand and said, "This is where I went." I stepped forward. The floor rippled under my feet. He turned, walked through another doorway, not rectangular, octagonal. It shimmered like the air above fire. I followed. Inside was the sky, but not our sky. It had texture, like velvet and metal and glass all at once. Stars flickered in fractals. Every sound was a note, and every note was saying something. Then I saw them, the Watchers, tall, motionless, their heads ringed with rotating light. Not faces, just ideas of faces. And they all turned toward me at once. I fell to my knees. He stood beside me. "They chose you," he whispered. I delayed it, but time doesn't stop. It folds. It finishes. I asked him, "What do they want?" He looked down at me, smiled, then whispered, "To see if we reflect." And then I woke up, in the hallway. Palmer kneeling over me, paramedics shouting, my father's room, empty, the walls scorched, and in the center of the room, nothing but a spiral burned into the concrete. Part 6. Reflections. They never found him again. The room was sealed within the hour. Cleaners arrived in hazmat suits. Every recording device had gone blank at 3:14 a.m. Monitors, audio logs, body cams. Blank, but still running. Like time had skipped sideways and left the sensors confused. The spiral on the floor wasn't just scorched. It was burned through to the steel beneath the concrete. Melted in a perfect, depthless curve. They closed the facility the next day. Classified everything. Palmer disappeared. No calls, no emails, no warning. Just gone. They let me go. Too dangerous to keep, too dangerous to kill. So they erased the records and sent me home. Back to Oregon. Back to a life that didn't fit anymore. Because the dreams didn't stop. Because I remembered. Not just the corridor, Not just the door, but the space beyond. What they showed me, what I showed them. Some nights, I still hear my father's voice. Not like a memory, closer, inside. Sometimes he speaks in words, sometimes in images, but always the same message. They're still listening. I stopped using mirrors, covered the ones I couldn't remove. Reflections aren't safe anymore. Not when you know something might be looking back through them. Not when you know sometimes your reflection keeps moving after you've gone still. Last week, I received a package. No return address, no postmark. Inside, a Polaroid photo. It showed the corridor, door open. Same velvet sky glow. In the photo, a figure stood at the edge, wearing my clothes, holding the notebook my father once gave me. But the figure's face, blurred, unclear, like it hadn't been chosen yet. On the back of the photo, a single phrase, handwritten in neat block letters. The fold remembers. So now I wait. I don't sleep much. I don't go out after dark, because I know the moment is coming again. That somewhere, above or below or inside, a door is opening, and something is watching to see if I'll walk through, or if I already have. The end.